Hello again, everybody, and welcome to our webinar on anti-testing activism during a global pandemic. My name is Oren Pizmony-Levy. I'm an associate professor at Teachers College, Columbia University, and it is really my honor to be the moderator of today's event. We are going to have two rounds of discussions. In the first round, I'm going to ask the panelists to reflect and suggest reasons for why it is important to opt out and engage with the opt-out movement in 2021. In the second round, I will ask my colleagues to suggest tips, guidelines, and any other advice on how to actually opt out from standardized testing, or how to join the movement and support it with different activities. So for the first round of the discussion, I'm going to ask each of my colleagues, I will call you by name, I will ask you to introduce yourself, your name, professional background, and organizational affiliation. And then I will ask you to talk for 5 or 6 minutes about why you think parents and teachers should opt out in 2021. The first will be Denisha Jones.
Hi, thank you all. My name is Denisha Jones. I'm the director of the Art of Teaching graduate teacher education program at Sarah Lawrence College in New York. And I am affiliated with a lot of organizations who've been pushing opt-out, including United Opt-out, National Uniting to Save Our Schools, Badass Teachers Association, and Defending the Early Years, and Network for Public Education. And I was the one who got to ask Biden the question about testing that brought us all here in 2019. So there was a public education forum, the first of its kind, where we had, was it 7 or 9? 7 or maybe 8 or 9 of the Democratic candidates at that time in December of 2019, all coming to an event to talk just about public education, organized by Journey for Justice, the Schott Foundation, and a bunch of other organizations, AFT, NEA, right? It was a really historic event because very rarely do we get these organizations talking about public education. And I was informed you get to ask Biden a question. He was the last person to speak that day, I believe. So all day I was kind of thinking about my question. There's so much about testing like that I wanted to say. Like it's a very long question because I wanted to like drive home the fact that it's bad in a lot of ways, right? It's bad in early childhood, which a lot of people don't think about because the testing happens in 3rd grades. But I can assure you the practice begins in kindergarten, as I was told when I was a kindergarten teacher that I had to teach children how to bubble in for the practice test that they would get in 1st grade, right? And this was back in 2003. And it's impacting kindergarten. So I talked about early childhood education and how teachers can't do what they're trained and prepared to do. I've been in teacher education for almost 18 years now. And a lot of my students always say, well, you taught me how to do great stuff, but I can't do any of that because I have to prepare them for tests. And that's all I get to do. And it's racist and it comes from eugenics. And I wanted to mention that and clearly said that to candidate Biden at the time, right? Given the history of standardized testing, we're created to prove racial inferiority, and they continue to do so, right? In this way that, will you end standardized testing? Will you commit to ending standardized testing if elected president? And he said yes. And he pretty much said, you're preaching to the choir. I know testing is not good. It shouldn't drive the curriculum. Teachers should be free to determine for themselves how children are taught. He went on and on and on. I mean, honestly, I didn't believe him then because I know that Democrats are not really friendly when it comes to pushing back against education reforms like testing and charters and things like that. But, this was pre-COVID, right? December 2019. Then COVID comes and we lose testing for an entire year. And it's like, yes, we were so close. And I think that's why he went back on his promise, because the testing companies know this. 2 years with no test data and the whole house of cards will crumble because they can't operate without that data. And they know that. And that's why in the middle of a pandemic, you see the administration pushing testing. And I just, look, I don't have kids, right? I get it. But like there's so much going on in schools right now that I can't imagine that the only thing on your mind is going back and having to prepare to take a test, which they said won't count. Then why are we giving it? Why are we giving it? If you were okay with getting rid of testing in December of 2019, you should be 100% okay getting rid of testing in the middle of a global pandemic that is still impacting our students and our families at uneven rates, right? We can't even get all kids on equipment. Can you just imagine all of this testing online and how it's going to crash the system? And again, it's just being used to collect data that we don't need. We know which kids or how kids are doing in schools if we just ask teachers. And we need to push back against this narrative of learning loss, which is also very racist and classist. It's a way to set children up and their families already for failure, right? They're not talking about learning loss to the kids who got a private pod teacher with their 4 close friends, right? No one's worried about their learning loss. It's just the Black and the brown and the poor white kids that are going to be called, a generation of learning loss, and that are going to get scripted curriculums and more testing to prove what we already know. They were born into poverty, and poverty continues to determine the type of education they receive in this country. That's all that testing really tells us. It doesn't tell us anything else. And I encourage all parents, this is not what your child needs. Going back to school is important, and children need to be prepared for it. So they need therapy, they need play, they need to build resilience, right? They've been surviving a global pandemic. And so the thought of testing right now, it's not needed. And don't let anyone tell you your child is behind. Your child has been surviving a pandemic. I observe my students teaching online in New York, and I go into these spaces, and what I see are young children navigating complex Zoom systems like we just did. And it's not just Zoom, right? They have to go into Schoology and do this, and they have to go into this and do this, and they're doing it all. And they've got people around them learning, and they're trying to focus. And I see them showing their immense resilience and ability to get this done and then continue to do it. So I don't see learning loss. It's not real. I see learning that looks different. I see learning that doesn't happen in the 4 walls of a school building, but it's still learning, right? Kids are always learning. And I think that's really what's important. And we need to push back against these narratives that we don't need these standardized tests. And I know you'll hear this from different groups. You'll hear this from supposed civil rights groups and allies. But again, anybody who's claiming we need testing, if you do a search through the organization and who they get funding from people who want testing, people who make a profit off of testing. And that's really what's happening here. And that's not what we need for our kids. The only testing that we need is COVID testing. And we need vaccinations. And that's what really should be happening. So I'll stop there and let you turn it over to someone else.
Thank you so much, Denisha. Next, I'll invite Ricardo Rosa.
So thank you immensely for the invitation. In Massachusetts, the high stakes test is called the Massachusetts Comprehensive Assessment System, and it goes by the acronym MCAS. So anti-MCAS, activists in Massachusetts and organizers sometimes change up the acronym, to say that it's really the Massachusetts, child abuse system. Right, so I want to engage, right, the work of critical Black and queer feminists, to deepen, this narrative of high stakes testing and the issue of abuse. I'm particularly drawn to a scholar at my institution whose name is Vivian Salehana, and she looks at abuse in the context of the criminal justice system. So why should we opt out? For me, it's very simple. The test is deeply, abusive. So, I want to look at abusive relationships structurally and sort of institutionally. And I want to claim that, the reason why testing abuse is so powerful in the United States, it's because it's coherent, with structural systemic racism, as Denisha has pointed out, and white supremacy. And these are pillars on which the country was built, right? So in order to sustain high stakes testing, power and control must be exerted in the same way that power and control is exerted in an abusive relationship, right? So what abusers do is they isolate their targets, right? They manipulate them and create this world, where their targets feel like there's no life beyond the life of that relationship, right? So we see this in so many ways with high stakes testing, right? Increasingly, educators don't connect with each other. They're in a constant state of anxiety, right, and competition. If they do connect, it's in a controlled environment guided by the logics of testing, right? The professional, learning environments and that type of nonsense in schools, right? So, the objective, right, is really, again, no human connection, right? And, they're in order to be rewarded personally as educators, to safeguard their job, to improve their team's standing or their schools and school district scores, they must maintain fidelity, right, to whatever curriculum or platform that will guarantee a higher score on the test. You know, when educators deviate, they're threatened very often, they're shamed, they're blamed, right? They have to cease, right? Anything that's joyful and engaging at a moment's notice, right? Because, you know, some administrator or group has identified a key test-taking skill that the school needs to improve, right? So there's really no intellectual life, right, in the school outside of the logic of testing, right? So if it does emerge, right, it's quickly extinguished, right? Of course, students are also isolated in the sense that, you know, they're socialized into believing that testing and test prep is the norm in education, right? Skill and drill and lower order thinking is what they know. In fact, it's sometimes the case that when creative teachers, right, try to get creative and move deeper, right, into the life of the mind, students are uncomfortable, right? And many may refuse to engage, right? They're so used to schooling sort of as a ritual performance, right? So the cycle of abuse, right, teaches us that once isolation has happened, the progression of violence causes further isolation of the target, right? Students are moved further and further from engaging their own reality, right? Or making a connection between their realities and knowledges to which they're exposed, right? They're prevented from engaging with others, right? And their communities so as to expand their knowledge because the testing scope is sequenced, right? Doesn't allow it, right? So they repeat basically what they're told because they feel secure, right? Saying what the test demands to hear, right? And this for me is a form of violence, right? They fear punishment, right? We're not regurgitating, right? So safety is in repeating what the abuser wants to hear, right? Not feeling safe to intellectually explore, for me, is abusive, right? One of our greatest needs as human beings, right, is this need to create, right? So to interrupt that need, right, is to do violence to people, right? Isolation also happens in the sense that, you know, what qualifies as education, right, only lives within the four walls of school, right? And even more disturbingly, right, within the script of the test makers, right? So the education that goes on in families and communities is totally colonized, you know, by test prep time. So I see this as tremendously problematic. I'll stop there. I time myself, folks, just to make sure I stop at 5 minutes.
You are good. Thank you, Ricardo. I want to remind our audience to use the Q&A button on your Zoom screen. If you want to raise any question for the panelists, we will have time to collect questions once we are done with this round. So thank you, Ricardo, again. And now we are moving to Bob Schaeffer from Fair Test.
Thank you, Oren. And thank you all in United Opt-out National for pulling this together. One of the great advantages of not going first is you can say what they said. And I say that to Denisha and to Ricardo, amen. Fair Test, the National Center for Fair and Open Testing, where I'm the interim executive director, has been working on these issues for 3.5 decades. There are reams of books, some behind me, that show that standardized testing is a very poor instrument to do anything useful in the education arena. Always has. It's biased, it's inaccurate, the results are widely misused, and it doesn't help improve teaching and learning, which is the primary purpose of assessment, to give feedback to educators and students so that they can learn better and more happily. Standardized testing doesn't contribute to any of that. And this year, in the middle or maybe towards the end of a pandemic, it's an even worse idea. Standardized tests were canceled nationally in spring 2020 for very good reasons. This year, those reasons have not changed at all. In fact, in many ways, they were even worse situation, yet politicians in Washington, D.C. and in state capitals, and we should not let state governments off the hook here. Most high stakes in testing do not come from the feds, they come from state governments, and we need to pressure both of them through opt-outs and other strategies to change. But the notion of testing in a pandemic takes everything that's wrong with standardized tests in normal times and makes them even worse. There is no such thing as standardized education in this in the last 2 years. Kids are learning in very different ways. Some are purely remote, some are hybrid, some are in schools, some aren't connected at all because their homes lack internet, and the hijacking connection at the local McDonald's is very erratic. The notion that you can get any measure from a test given to kids whose learning experiences and life experiences has been so very different is totally insane. Beyond that, the tests will fail to meet the basic standards of any assessment. They won't be reliable, they won't be valid, and they won't be educational useful. And they will pile on the biases that standardized tests have always had, going back to it, as Denisha said, their eugenicist roots. What we need to do moving forward is to use opt-out as a strategy to force policymakers, both inside the Beltway in Washington and the national groups that support them in many cases, as well as our state policymakers and governors, legislators, state boards of education, to face the reality here and make the changes that are necessary. And that involves, one, approving federal waivers for states that go way beyond what the Biden administration has said is possible. Total, comprehensive blanket waivers of any standardized testing requirements are the real goal. And Joe Biden and the new Secretary of Education, Dr. Cardona, can reverse the decision and do that. Secondly, we need to get states to suspend all their high stakes assessments. New York State yesterday suspended most of their high stakes. I'm talking about things like graduation tests, grade promotion tests, tests that are used to rate and rank teachers, tests that are used to rate school districts in individual school buildings. They're all garbage in normal times. They're even worse right now. They need all to be eliminated. And we need to ratchet up pressure on favor of good performance-based assessments like that the New York Performance-Based Assessment Consortium is doing as an alternative to this insane, simple-minded, standardized testing, which doesn't make sense even in so-called normal times. Now, Fair Test has been in this business for a long time. Our website is a hub, a roundtable of resources for all kinds of groups. Here's what we've seen in the last several weeks. In February, the level of visits to our K-12 opt-out and other materials was about double what it had been in the previous February. It was 4 times as high. Yesterday, compared with the same day in 2020, we had 10 times as many visitors to our website. The public school parents, some student groups, advocates, community leaders are fed up with this standardized testing nonsense. And we need to point them in a direction to make social change by stopping testing this year, using it as a lever to open up the world of better forms of assessments, and to move forward into a system where the goal is to improve learning and teaching, not to generate numbers for bureaucrats or lobbyists or testing companies. On our website at fairtest.org, a host of resources, including an opt-out guide to support this movement. We're very pleased to be working with you. Let's win it this time.
Thank you so much. And Bob, if you want to put the link to your website,
Sure, will do.
Chat box, that will be great. Next, we are moving to Ceresta Smith.
Okay, I, along with Bob, hail from Florida, which is ground zero for everything. We have all the various variants of the virus here. We have the spring break crowd here coming in and out. We have the most egregious forms of testing and punishment that I think in comparison to any state, we're probably the worst. And I think many of us know that this started with Jeb Bush and his A+ program. So Florida was kind of like one of the initial states, along with Texas, that started this whole scenario of this extreme testing that was used to assess school quality, to assess each individual student in 3rd through 8th grade and once in high school, they began to use it to just ruin the quality of pedagogy that we should have here in the United States. So we're ground zero here. And what got me involved in this movement in the first place was when I was working at a school that was pretty much populated with a very large group of affluent students, okay? It was a school that was known for sending, it was one of those public schools and magnet schools that was known for sending students to Ivy League colleges and universities. It was a school that had all the facilities that you would want inside a school that would help make students well-rounded, well-versed, productive. I was asked to move to a school that was a predominantly Black school to facilitate and act as a reading coach. This school was rated a very low D, almost an F. And so I was asked to go into the school, and I got there and I was aghast. I couldn't believe, I felt like I had walked back into the 1940s or 50s where everything was inferior and less than for the Black students, in contrast to the majority. At the time, that school was majority Jewish and white, with some people of color. I couldn't believe what I was going through. In the school, there was no academic freedom for the teachers whatsoever. The students were denied field trips. They were denied elective courses. They were taking double blocks of math, double blocks of reading and language arts, as well as science. They had no freedom whatsoever when it came to be able to choose electives. There was a small group of academic achievers at the school that basically still had what I call quality pedagogy, but the vast majority of the school was on a lockdown. And I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that it was being run like a plantation system where groups of white people would come into the building and tell the Black educators that they're to do this, 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 and this. And it's very scripted curricula that was trash. In all honesty, it was trash. And I couldn't believe it. And I found other people on Facebook that were recognizing the same thing, Jesse Turner being one, Bess Altworth being another. And together we formed Save Our Schools and had the first March on Washington to bring attention to the fact that this was going on across the nation. And so anyway, that's how I got into this. And from that first gathering with Save Our Schools, United Opt-out was formed. We figured, a group of us together figured that, well, why don't we just shut down the test? They're using the testing to do all of these things. Why don't we just shut it down? Because we knew, most of us being educators, some of us in higher ed, some of us in K through 12, we knew it was basically trash, and that it was basically trashing the quality of public education as well. And so United Opt-out set out to actually create opt-out guides for each individual state based on what was going on in each individual state. That became very cumbersome after a while, and it became very hard to do because, as you guys know, each year there was a change. There was a change in the type of test. There was a change in the name of the test. There was a change in how many tests that particular states were going to throw on the students and the staffs. And so we helped facilitate states create their own opt-out guides. Now, here in Florida, they have a method of participating, but minimal participation, which I don't agree to whatsoever. For United Opt-out, it's completely opt out of the test. Don't give them any opportunity to have you sit in any scenario. And that's very important during this pandemic, because right now, as we speak, they have what is called the retake students. These are students who are who have so-called not achieved the score. I don't want to use the term fail because they haven't failed anything, but they have not achieved the score, which is a moving target, because every year it's a different target that they're trying to get to. They're retaking their reading test and their math EOCs, into the course exams right now. And a vast majority of the upperclassmen here in Miami-Dade County Public Schools are actually my school online students. They're not in the building. and for various different reasons. They have extended family that they don't want to bring infection to. And believe it or not, because a lot of their parents have lost their income, a lot of these students are now working full time. So there are various different reasons they're not in the building, but they want them to come back into the building to test. Well, last Thursday, we had a situation at the school where I used to work. A student came back in. He was positive for COVID and sick. And his parent knew it, but thinking my son has to go in here and take this test, he exposed the whole test environment in a building that has poor ventilation, exposed everyone to the virus. And one teacher ended up sick 4 days later. So the parents here in Florida do not want to send their children inside these schools, and for good reason. I mean, we're third in the nation right now, I think, for infections. Florida has always had a high positivity rate. It's never gone below 5%. We have, as I stated before, all the variants are here in South Florida in the ones that are easily transmissible. So the parents are very upset. They do not want to send their children into these testing scenarios because they know what could possibly happen in the long run. We're in a state where legislators now are trying to pass laws that no one will be held accountable if somebody goes into this school environment, ends up sick, or ends up losing their life. Florida has lost lives. They've lost lives of children. They've lost lives of educators. They've lost lives of staffs. So people have died, and they're not all the time. For the most part, they're people that are 50 and under. So it's the reality is here. We know since we've been in school since October, we know the reality of what will happen, can and will happen to people when they do come back into these schools. So I think this is a golden opportunity. Why should they opt out? Protect yourself and your child physically, your health, for number one, during this pandemic year. But also, as everyone here has stated, this is a violent, it is a racist practice. It is part of the structural racism that supposedly we as Americans are now recognizing and wanting to end. If they're ever really going to work on this, they're going to have to get rid of the structural racism that goes along with these standardized tests. So if we want to improve the quality of pedagogy in this country, because I think most college educators can actually say, we used to get students who were able to do A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and now they're getting students where they have to do a lot of remediation on the college level because they don't have the writing skills. I teach the upper level kids, the older students, and because they spent so much time on learning how to write poorly for the standardized test, it takes the whole year to actually teach them the writing that they're going to need to be able to do for college level coursework. And it's just sad when I get them each year, and these are bright kids, to see how they've been so miseducated. And not that I feel like everybody needs to know the difference between a subject and a predicate and a preposition, but it helps. These kids know nothing about structure. Nothing about it. All the stuff that we received in elementary school that helped build our reading and writing capability, they have none of that. It's all test prep, what they're going to get on the test. So it's sad, but I'll end there.
Okay, thank you, Ceresta. Last, my colleague, Amy Stuart Wells.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to this important panel. And I'm going to echo what everyone's already said on this panel. And just bring a perspective that I started my career as a researcher looking at issues of segregation and systemic racism within education, not studying standardized testing. And then a couple years ago, I had to give a big talk to a bunch of researchers at the American Educational Research Association, and started looking more carefully at the relationship between segregation and testing, and just trying to understand the nexus of those two, and delve more and more into the research, the work that Oren has done and others. And what I really talked about in that talk was these 4 pillars of kind of the new Jim Crow of education, which is systemic racism, and how testing drives that entire system, both by defining an achievement gap that isn't based on the valued knowledge of the students, the communities, or even what employers say that they want in educated graduates from our schools. And just even what the psychometricians, those who write the tests, say that tests should never be used in this way to define a student's trajectory, and the use of one test in that way to totally detrack a student off of, in terms of their achievement and their progression through the system. Just also experts on learning, right? Learning theory, those of us in education, but also the National Academies of Medicine and Science and Engineering, who talk about the importance of culture in learning, experience in learning, which we knew in the field of education. Just some recent research on employers, what they're looking for in the post-pandemic era. They want agility and flexibility. They want ability to work in teams. They want the ability to keep learning, lifelong learners. Okay, none of this is measured by standardized tests. The second kind of pillar of the new Jim Crow of education as it relates to testing was what several of the panelists have talked about, which is the teaching to the test and how that's disproportionately affecting low-income students and students of color. And particularly the loss of civic education and the importance of civic education and history and social studies in like the history of movements, particularly the civil rights movement. So Vanessa Settle-Walker's work on Black educators in the South shows this powerful connection between civic education and the beginning of the civil rights movement through the de jure segregated Black schools. And the Black educators who were teaching students in those schools knew exactly what they were doing by using learning theory, lesson plans related to participatory democracy. Similarly, arts education, which is more than enrichment, it's so powerful in terms of youth activism. We see in working with groups like the Epic Theater Ensemble in New York City, that youth artists is at the center of civic dialogue and that it changes that dialogue. And when we're cutting arts education out of our schools, it's silencing those activists. Thirdly, we saw the relationship between punishment, right, and policing Black and brown bodies within schools and the rise of police within schools as very parallel to the rise of standardized tests, right? And this way of framing schools and the no excuses schools and punishing students for low test scores, both through lack of access to opportunities, but also just through policing and trying to control students at this in terms of teaching to the test and disciplinary actions. And finally, we just see the way in which at the policy level, the testing regime has really justified segregation, right? So the ways in which the perpetuation of segregation and inequality in the system is validated through test scores, right? So whether it's parents making choices about where they can move, where they can live, what schools they're choosing for their students, using test scores as the sole measure of school quality of good and bad schools is a racialized way of coded language around good and bad schools that relates to Black and brown students in some schools and white students in other schools. And then defining good schools only in a very racialized way, which just perpetuates the segregation. So that's where my thinking was right before the pandemic. And then just throughout the pandemic, we've been kind of tracking things that people who know a lot about teaching and learning, like the panelists tonight, have been saying about what we should be moving towards in the post-pandemic possibility of education. And there's kind of these 3 pillars that are all intertwined. One, you hear a lot about being more student-centered, more focused on the whole children, remembering the importance of social and emotional development in education, that the pandemic has reminded us of this. We've seen just a burgeoning of the anti-racist education movement that includes culturally relevant pedagogy, racial literacy, ethnic studies, the growth in ethnic studies. So those 2 things cannot happen unless we de-emphasize standardized testing, right? So this post-pandemic future should be very much focused on student-centered learning, anti-racist education, and de-emphasizing or eliminating standardized test scores as a way to measure student ability and progress. So that's kind of where the research is. The research is with us on this. And as I said, even the psychometricians, people who write the tests, would agree that this should never be used, tests should never be used in the way they're currently being used in the system.
Thank you so much, everybody, for keeping the time. This will give us some time to collect questions from the audience. We received a lot of questions. I'm not sure we'll be able to do all of them. So please bear with me. I think the first question, maybe I'll ask Denisha and Ricardo to respond. Kamala is asking how to respond to parents and colleagues who talk about the needs of the test because of the learning loss. I think in your statements earlier, Denisha, you challenged this narrative of learning loss. But what would be your response to someone saying, oh, we have to test because otherwise, how would we know that there is learning loss?
Yeah, I think, so this is coming up now. I'm in the middle of, I'm analyzing data from a study I did with a colleague. We were interviewing teachers about COVID. We did a survey. We got like 1,000 people to respond to the survey. And then we had about 25 teachers say they would do an interview about what happened last year, right? And so we were like tracing the end of last year and now this year in the reopening. And one of the questions we asked was, so tell us a little bit about how you aligned the curriculum to make up for the instruction that didn't happen in the last spring. Everyone said across the board, and it's only 20 teachers, but they're across the country, all states, all demographics, right? That all learning stopped in spring. The mandate was you teach nothing new when we went virtual in March of last year. You can, everyone's grade had to stay the same. You can let them make up work from periods 1, 2, 3, but no teacher we spoke to said you could teach anything new. So that would mean then when you come in, right, to the next year, so I had a high school chemistry teacher, right? So I said, okay, so you left the whole marking period there at the end. What happened then in next year? She goes, nothing. We didn't have to do nothing, right? Because the tests were canceled. So there was no need to go over the curriculum. I mean, at the end of the day, that fourth quarter of 10th grade chemistry didn't really matter because there was no exam to measure whether you crammed all that information into their head or not, right? And there was no plan, right? The teachers who were teaching AP, they were like, well, we were already there and then the AP tests were canceled, so there wasn't nothing to do. The art teachers, the language arts teachers, the math teachers, they were just like, no, they were fine, right? When we started, I think the math teachers were like, they looked at it a little bit and said, okay, let's think about what they're gonna need next year, if there's any concepts, but it was fine. It was fine because the tail that wags the dog, the testing, wasn't there to pressure them to make up for the supposed lost learning, right? So what is being lost, right? I think that's just, it's absurd to think that children aren't learning all day, every day, right? Like we have to disabuse people of that notion. And I would clearly say that's a racist construct to label children who didn't have a pandemic pod teacher in their home during this type of schooling, right? And like children were learning, they were learning a lot. And the teachers know what to do when they get our students back. They know how to help them get the skills that they need, get them through where they need to be. That's the teacher's job. We don't trust teachers in this country. And that's why we believe in something called learning loss. And that because you didn't suffer through 3 months of a scripted curriculum, you're missing out, right? And I think that narrative is being used to push this testing. And I would just clearly say it's racist, it's classist, and it's really just harmful to children and their families. Like think about what your child did starting in March of last year and all this time, and really how they came. My nephew had lots of growth. He got closer to his brother. He got closer to his family. He explored different things that he would have never explored before. He learned a lot. He didn't miss out on anything. So again, we just have to push back on that every time we hear it. And I think, my colleague, unfortunately, who couldn't be here today, Jesse Hagopian, he writes an article, which I'll link to in the chat, in the Progressive, and he uses, I think it's Kenyatta Taylor's work, right? And she's taking this learning loss narrative and comparing it to super predators, right? We crack babies, right? These are the same type of labels that are used generationally to target specific children. And that's what we're seeing now. They're gonna be called a generation of learning loss, right? And that's gonna follow them the way those other labels have followed that. So we need to look at it historically and understand where this narrative comes from.
Thank you. Ricardo, would you like to add something?
Thank you. So I didn't properly introduce myself earlier. So I just want to say I'm on the steering committee of an organization called Save Our Schools, an organization I deeply appreciate because they're looking not only at this issue of opting out, but the root cause, of a lot of the issues we're talking about, which is racialized capitalism. So I would invite everyone to take a look at USOS's platform. And I think it's a really powerful testament to what we should be doing in education and beyond. So I want to say, with regards to this issue of learning loss, right? We get that in Massachusetts all the time. Folks are now talking about, we don't really believe in the testing, but obviously we gotta measure learning loss, given the pandemic. Classic narrative of abusers. Abusers tend to, on some level, right, apologize for their behavior and present some promise of change, right? This narrative of measuring learning loss, but not really believing in the test is one of those tactics, right? So, this is the most dangerous part of the relationship, in my view. This is where the victim or the target of abuse is enthralled, sort of within the narrative, the promises and the illusions of the abuser, right? In Massachusetts, we have a commissioner who has promised to scale down the test and to push it back so that it's taken later in the year, right? To be clear, the students come back in April, right? Face to face, all of the students come back, and then they're taking the test sometime in May, right? Even the SAT folks, right, are attempting to seduce us, with this promise of factoring adversity scores, right? As if it can be done, right? These are all illusions in my view, and these are all sort of tactics, of abusers, So I want to say that, as far as this narrative of learning loss goes, the interest is not in assessing the learning loss, obviously, right? It's about using these tests, right? These tests have always been used to assess learning gains and learning loss according to the test makers and all these folks, right? And so what they've actually been doing all along, right, is using these assessments, right, to withdraw resources, right, from schools that need it the most, right? Or they impose more test prep, right, more testing platforms, more remedial classes, everything that we know does not work. So it's not about learning loss, right? What they want to do, right, is use the pandemic to justify further attacks on public schools, to justify the need for more charter schools, right? If these tests are such a great tool, to measure learning loss, why aren't they being used in private schools? That's one of the things I would pose, right? The textbook in the testing industry generates in Massachusetts alone, right, $20 to $30 billion almost, right, a year on high stakes testing like the MCAS. I should say nationally, but that figure is factored into Massachusetts. Right? That's why we're really going back to school in Massachusetts and in many states. It's not because of care for children, right? You don't bring students back for almost a year, right, of virtual instruction, right? And instead of allowing them to build relationships with teachers and their peers, you place a test in front of them, right? That's what's happening in most states, right? That's not an ethic of care. That's educational malpractice, to the hilt, And very often I don't just call this thing, structural racism. It is structural racism, but I tend to frame it as a whiteness protection program, right?
Mhm.
That's what it does. It protects whiteness, right? And this doesn't really protect white people, because whiteness is not about protecting white people, right? So for those kids who are scoring well, right, we have to question, the fact that they really got robbed of their education as well. Right, so we need to be sure to frame that aspect of it. And the reason why I call it a whiteness protection program is that it's not just about education. It's about gentrification. It's about using those test scores to fuel a whole lot of violence, in communities of color, right? So I'll stop there. Taking too much time.
No worries. Thank you, Ricardo. The next question is interesting. I think more philosophically. I thought maybe Amy and Ceresta would like to take it. Basically, Dan is asking, are tests used to trap the less powerful in a paradigm where they can never live up to the demands of the oppressors?
Amy, you want to go first? You can give the data on it and the research on it, and I'll give you the practical experience.
Oren, could you repeat it one more time, the question?
Dan is asking, are tests, standardized tests, used to trap the less powerful in a paradigm where they can never live up to the demands or the standards of the oppressors?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I have to quote one of my favorite New York City principals, former principal, Jill Bloomberg, who says the best test takers look the most like the test makers, right? Right, because it's about, you know, cultural biases. So, so very similar to like some of the famous sociologists who talk about the curriculum, say within schools or within higher education, that really favor students who've had certain experiences in their life, certain cultural orientations. That are usually the white privileged families. And so if the schools are measuring that and rewarding that, and those are the students who are succeeding the most in the system, then it's absolutely reproducing the same inequality and the racial hierarchy and defining that as ability and merit, which we know, you know, we really need to challenge and really need to broaden that definition. So thank you for that question.
Thank you, Amy. Ceresta?
Yeah, and the false narrative, really, when you look at it, they try to say that with these test scores and with the data that they get, it will help open up opportunity for everyone. And that opportunity for everyone comes in the form of school choice. You can choose to put your child in a school that you feel will serve that child's need. When we look at how school choice works in Florida, the vast majority of people of color who try to take advantage of the voucher system, the K scholarships, et cetera, all the little devious plans that they have where they can take public dollars and channel into private institutions. When you look at how that is really working in the state of Florida, the people of color who tend to use these vouchers, they end up in what one person referred to as Jim Crow schools. Schools that are predominantly people of color, that are still doing the compromised curricula with the scripted, very much scripted curricula that is not doing anything to serve anybody's intellectual capabilities whatsoever. And then we find that there's a group of their white counterparts that are able to take these vouchers and supplement tuitions to your more expensive private schools. So you've got that dichotomy going on right away, where it's creating a de facto segregation. It's not only doing that, it's creating that paradigm too, where you have that as Dr. Ibram Kendi referred to it as that caste system, that racial caste system that is put in place, and it's always going to benefit the oppressor, so to speak. It's always going to benefit them in ways. And the other scary thing regarding that is one of the Floridians that actually was a part of the storming of the Capitol building. This one hasn't been arrested yet, to my knowledge. However, he woke up after this happened, and he published an article where he talked about, not an article, but he published it on Facebook, where he talked about how what's going on now with a lot of these schools, these charter schools and the private parochial schools, hate is being taught in these schools. A lot of those people that you saw storming the Capitol that were in their 20s and their 30s, they're coming out of these schools. They're coming out of the home schools that are preaching white supremacy and hate. So a lot of our tax dollars is going to that effort as well, which gets to be very scary. And nobody is really exploring this to the degree that I think it needs to be explored. He actually posted samples of the literature that they were being exposed to and that they were being taught. And it didn't shock me because I knew it had been going on. But when you just saw it out there plainly, it was very disturbing. And that helps create that paradigm where you have the white supremacists now taking advantage of all these things to keep that in place, the supremacy in place, to keep and to actually recruit more people into that convoluted mentality. And sadly too, it's happening in these Christian schools. It's becoming so much a part of the Christian schools and is being incorporated into their religious doctrine as well. So very, very disturbing and very true what the gentleman said.
Thank you, Ceresta. We are going to collect a couple of more questions, and then I would like to move to the next round of discussion about tips and strategies for opting out, because I get a lot of questions and comments about that. Bob Schaeffer, there is a question that is coming again and again in the Q&A, where people are asking why teachers and teacher unions and parents are surrendering themselves into this testing regime. Why don't we see an uprising of parents and teachers unions against this testing regime?
Well, first of all, both national teachers unions are strongly opposed to what the Biden administration has been doing. Becky Pringle, the president of the NEA, and Randy Weingarten, the president of the AFT, have both spoken out strongly against the refusal to cancel standardized tests this year. That said, it's hard for many working teachers to stand up because they fear that they will lose their jobs. I see a number of teachers nodding their heads, as I said, and Amy. I mean, if your superintendent's job depends on test scores and he tells his principals to boost the test scores, you teachers stand up, you're a second year or you are in a right to work state.
We're losing Bob.
Maybe along with millions of other Americans, we have seen places where Teachers United have stood up and forced significant changes in educational and assessment policies. In Chicago, the Chicago Teachers Union made testing policies an organizing issue in their contract negotiations and won significant cutbacks in tests. That's what we'd like to see in more unions around the country. But to assume that people are in this economy, with the kind of discrimination that exists, are going to be willing to stand up to lose their jobs on principle is asking them to do an awful lot. What can happen is that teachers can work in support of parents who really have the power here. Testing is not an educational issue. It's a political and ideological issue. And people need to understand that the change is not going to become from debating facts, but from mobilizing political power and clout to change the behavior of policymakers or to replace them. A very good model is the opt-out folks in New York State, led by mothers for the most part, who have not only built a strong opt-out movement, but turned it into a political movement and made it clear to their elected officials in Albany and Washington, D.C., that if you don't support assessment reform and the right to opt out, you're going to lose your job. And in New York State, where there is no legal right to opt out, there's nothing in statute or regulation that says you can opt out, as the laws in some states, Colorado, Oregon, California, Michigan, et cetera, say there are ways to opt out. In New York State, it was an act of civil disobedience. And enough parents got together to build a strong education and political movement that forced change. And in many cases, teachers work with these parents behind the scenes to build that movement and make it strong and effective. That seems like a model for victory around the country.
One thing that happens here in Florida, though, I want to add to that, is many of the parents fear opting out because they fear their child is going to lose that golden place in that great magnet program. They're fearful that their child is going to be put into remedial reading because they don't have a test score from them. And these are children that are academically proficient, clearly. And that's a major concern. And then Florida has attached on the high school level science and math and social studies to end of the course exams. They're afraid it's going to bring that GPA that they're trying to build because they're looking towards college admission. So there's those fears there. However, I try and allay those fears because my daughter didn't take any of the test. She matriculated into undergraduate school. She matriculated into graduate school with none of these tests being taken ever. And if parents are adamant, the school community will have to go along because ultimately, according to several Supreme Court decisions, parents do have the say. Ultimately, they do have the say regarding their child's education. My granddaughter, who was facing the retention in third grade because she opted out of the assessments for third grade, they tried to challenge my son, and my son simply said, "You don't know who my mother is. She's the opt-out queen." And so they had me come in, and I carefully explained to them, this was at the beginning of the school year, that she will be using a portfolio assessment to actually move from 3rd grade to 4th grade. And they had to go along with it. Not to say they didn't try to do little things during the year, like have her sit for an SAT 10 test, etc. But they realized that her parents and her grandmother were we were very adamant about her not taking the test. So as Bob says, it needs to come as a unified stance. Now, Massachusetts, where Ricardo is, they do have, at least the union does have an opt-out guide and actually informs people about opt-out. I've approached our president of FEA, Florida Educators Association, to see if he would be willing to do something similar, to start bringing our union in on it. Now, we are in a right to work state. There is concern about them continually trying to decertify our unions, but I still think it can be done, and it can be done legally, particularly during a pandemic, when you're talking about health and wellness.
Great. Thank you, Ceresta. I'm going to ask the panel one question, and then we'll move to the next round. We talked a lot tonight about the intersection between race, ethnicity, and education when it's coming to the issue of testing. Over the past 4 years, when my team and I at Teachers College have researched this movement, we heard a lot of comments from people about how white the movement is. There's a lot of concerns that 98% of the movement is white, at least from our studies and other analysis from Stanford, etc. And when I'm listening to everybody here, we have very different perspective. We are a very diverse set of panel. And I wonder how we can explain the gap between what we know about who is opting out and the leaders of the movement that are represented here. If Denisha, Ricardo, Bob, Amy, Ceresta, if you would like to comment about that, that would be very interesting.
Yeah, I just want to share one story about that. And that's what people are saying, but we have to remember, when white parents opt out, they get the press, right? The New York Times is not going to run a story of a Black mother in Detroit opting her 2 kids out, right? But I had a colleague in Ohio, a teacher, tell me what they were doing to a Black family out there. Black mom, 3 kids, you know, she convinced her to opt them kids out, and they said, okay. And then the next thing you know, the school district threatened to call CPS on the mother for educational malpractice against her children. This was a single Black mother raising 3 kids, living, working on the poverty line, and they knew they could dangle that threat in front of her and that she would give in. She didn't give in, because although I'm not licensed to practice law in Ohio, I was damn sure going to find somebody who was, to go down there and challenge that, right? But that's what happens when Black people try and do things that white people do, right? They get a lot of pushback in different ways. So I think that there are Black people who are opting out. I think in Houston, they had used to run opt-out academies. This is the other thing. Opting out is a privilege. It's a right, first of all. You're not asking the school anything. You're telling them. You're telling them your child is not taking the test, point blank, period. But it's also a privilege before COVID, right? Because what do you do with your kid if you're working and you're not sending them to school for the testing? In Houston, they had opt-out academies. They had retired teachers and other teachers organize places where parents could bring their kids for the week of testing so that they could then keep them out. And I saw pictures of Black parents posting what they did with their kids instead of take the test, right? They were traveling to the museums. They were doing all sorts of things. So there are Black parents and Latina parents and Asian American parents are opting out, but they're not getting the story, right? Because the media is not going to jump on it until the white moms of Long Island will opt out, right? And so that's the narrative we have to push back against. And I'm grateful that the white moms of Long Island are opting out, right? But we have to understand that they're going to code it and make it look like that these are the women, not Ceresta, who opted out her daughter long before. I mean, her daughter was at Howard when I was there, right? So she opted her out a while ago. Wasn't like, you know, she's a grown up now, right? And so we've seen people doing this, but it's about the stories that are being told.
Okay, thank you, Denisha. Anyone else want to respond to this question?
Could you repeat it? I was responding to something in the chat box. What was your question again?
So the question is about this narrative or sentiment that is out there that the opt-out movement is very white. 98, 97% of the respondents in our surveys in 2016, 2018 identified as white, a very educated, very specific class of people. And when I'm looking at the panelists today, I see much more diversity. When I'm looking at the administrators, when I'm looking at the leaders of the movement, I see a lot of diversity. And I'm trying to reconcile the two data points that I have. And Denisha offered one responses about the importance of understanding the media narrative about who is opting out and who is going to get attention or not. But if others want to comment about that, I think that would be very interesting for the audience. Go ahead, Ricardo.
So there's no question, that the movement to privatize public education has done a tremendous job at seizing, civil rights language and sort of capturing sort of the imagination of communities of color. There's no question. I think that's changing currently, but there's no question about that. I think what we have to do on our end is just think more deeply about the way we use language and the way we do our work. This is where Gramsci and all of these folks, in discourse analysis would be very helpful, right? So, for example, I read and I shared this with a lot of the organizers of the opt-out movement recently in Massachusetts, and we crafted a message around this issue. So I remember years ago reading an article about a hotel chain that put up some signs, telling folks, look, don't use so many towels because it's bad for the environment and what have you, And they found that, towels were continue to be used to the same rate, right? And then they crafted another message and they put up a sign that says, look, at this hotel chain, we don't use more than one towel, right? And so they found that there was a dramatic drop in the use of towels. Why? Because in the first narrative, people felt like they were outside of the norm, right? They were doing something that folks, and whereas in the second narrative, they felt like they were doing something in the norm, right? So we crafted our message to say, in Massachusetts, we opt out. And then we have another message below it, a sub-message. So I think that these are the types of languages that we need to circulate so that, when people choose to do this, they feel like they're acting within the norm, right? And you can take Massachusetts and you can substitute it for whatever community you like. And I think we'll see a difference in, this is one way to push back against the narrative of the sort of the seizing of civil rights discourses. But the other thing I want to say is that it's critically important to mobilize young people to sort of create the spaces where they mobilize and organize themselves. In New Bedford, we opened up a space and open up resources, for a group of young people to organize what's called Students Organizing for Unity and Liberation, or SOUL. And it's made up of 5 circle leaders. These are young people that graduated from the public high school and went on to some higher ed institution in the United States, or they're activists in their community. And what they do is they open up dialogues with young people in middle school and high school. And these are iterative, it's dialogues, it's dialogue, action, dialogue. So it's an iterative process, right? And, their understanding, they're critical in the sense that they believe that public schools are not gonna, stand by them. They're not designed to do that, right? So it's very important for us to create alternative spaces to public school while at the same time critiquing these institutions and trying to transform them, right? So in this sense, they're very critical in this sense, and they're seeing high stakes testing really as a form of surveillance. And so they're connecting sort of surveillance and high stakes testing to surveillance in crime and justice. And they're allowing sort of all of these movements to sort of coalesce around this idea of surveillance. And it's just brilliant. I'll stop there. I have a lot more to say about this group. But what they're doing currently on this issue of testing and pushing up against the criminal justice system is just powerful.
Okay.
I was approached, let me add this on. I was approached today and I'm by a person who works in an activist group. And he approached me today and said there is a principal in a school here in Miami-Dade County Public Schools that wants to stand up and say, no one in my building is testing. And he wants others to go along with that. Now, he's going to be taking a big risk. And I said I would be willing to work along with this to see if we can get other principals and administrators to stand up and say the same thing. I will support any parent in my building that is opting their child out of the testing. They are recognizing the danger, and they're recognizing not only the physical danger, but the other issues that go along with the standardized testing. So I think one thing that we need to start doing, which I don't think we've done enough of before, is actually going after administrators in these schools and actually we've tried, Denisha can attest to this, we've tried to approach civil rights groups before to get on board, but I think it would be more meaningful now to be able to try and get these two different groups to really get involved in an anti-testing movement.
Okay, thank you so much. Amy, do you want to say something?
I just wanted to point out the historical narrative as well in terms of, as I mentioned before, the Black educators that Vanessa Siddle-Walker and others have written about, and just the kind of progressive education strategies they were using in Harlem and in the South in the 1940s and 50s. And then we fired those teachers, right? A lot of the Black educators were fired in the 60s and 70s as we were doing desegregation policy and other things. And so the kind of the peak of distrust, I think, in communities of color with public schools was hitting about the 70s and 80s as the call for more testing and the accountability regimes were coming in, which led to this alignment with the civil rights movement around accountability in education. But, and so accountability is important. I just want to say that, but the measures that we're using for accountability are off for all the reasons we've been talking about tonight. But I think it's important to remember that historical context and that distrust of the system that actually led to, in some ways, to where we are today. So I think as we think about moving forward, we need to think about rebuilding that trust and hiring.
Amy, I think we lost your last sentence.
Oh.
Hiring.
And I'm sorry, hiring more teachers of color. Okay. As we're talking today about the demographics of the teaching force, we forget that history and how we had so many amazing educators of color who were fired in the past.
Great. Bob, do you want to comment about this, or are we good?
I'd like to move on to the next question, hear what people need to have answered.
Okay, so I think the next panel or round of discussion is really about tips for parents and teachers on how to opt out and how to engage schools with the opting out movement. A lot of questions in the Q&A are already raising questions about how do you deal with threats from the schools that your kid won't be able to move to the next grade, or if you're a teacher and there are threats on your job security, etc. So let's open up and collect tips and resources that you can all share for people that are watching this webinar on how to get engaged with the opt-out. And it could be, if you have a kids, how to opt out. If you're a teacher, how to engage. If you are neither, what can you do to help? I think that's the questions that people have on their mind. So Bob, let's start with you.
Well, Amy, it's easy to opt out in states, in about 10 states where there's a provision to opt out or refuse the test. All you need to do is tell your principal that you're going to opt out and do it. Elsewhere, it's an act of civil disobedience, but it's relatively easy to do, especially this year. The federal government, I put the link up, has already told states that it will not enforce the 95% participation requirement nonsense, which never punished any state. But there's going to be no reason for a superintendent, a principal, or a teacher to pressure kids to be tested this year. There's nothing in the federal system of accountability that requires kids to test. Beyond that, parents are going to need to put some of their focus on their state government to get rid of the high stakes misuses of tests like that here in Florida, where you have tests that are used or misused for grade promotion. They're used for graduation. They're used for teacher bonuses. They're used for school awards. They're used for eligibility for vouchers. The feds, who've gone nowhere near far enough in suspending the test, have encouraged states to waive all those high stakes consequences. They should be canceled every year, but particularly this year. And it's going to require mobilizing political pressure, in this case, focused on state representatives and senators, to get rid of those stupid requirements and let kids get back into school, deal with their emotional and social and educational needs as human beings by the educators who are professionally trained to work with them, not by relying on these external tools that never did a good job, even in normal times.
Thank you, Bob. Denisha, give us tips or guidelines for parents and teachers who would like to engage with the movement.
So again, I think parents, it's strength in numbers, talk to your kids. I want to go back, Ricardo said this, and I have to share this with you. When I was teaching at Trinity Washington University in DC, I was asked to teach a freshman writing class about my work in education. So I taught a class called Are You More Than a Score? About the opt-out movement. Now they're freshmen, right? They're fresh out of high school, they're in this class. All of them couldn't believe that they could have opted out of those tests. They were shocked when they found out, to the point where one girl went home and told her mom that her little siblings are not taking those damn tests like she did, and that they were going to push the opt out, right? So we really have to engage the youth too. I think at some point this should be the youth's decision. I have a friend who's a teacher. His daughter said, "Dad, I just want to take it," and he said, "Okay, fine, but just know you don't have to," right? So I think we need to reach out to them, because when they find this out, that there's a movement of adults saying you shouldn't have to sit through this, they don't find out till they get to college, right? If they find that at all. So talk to the students, right? Talk to your children and get parents together and talk to each other, and know that maybe your teacher doesn't agree and maybe the principal doesn't agree, but it doesn't matter, right? You don't need them to agree, but you do have to make the decision as a family, and you need to be clear about it. And I know there have been all types of tricks to keep people testing. A friend told me in Pennsylvania, they made you sign to come back to school, right? They made you sign for the virtual school, pretty much all your rights away, right? Those long contracts that they made you sign, pretty much all your rights, you couldn't opt out. Well, guess what? Your child can log into that system, not answer a single question, and log out of that system, and they have refused to take a test, but they've met their responsibility by logging in and then logging out. No one can just force your child to take a test, no matter what you signed off on. Yes, there are some states where they're going to tell you, they always are going to say that's not legal. Again, I'm not asking you for something. I'm telling you, my child is not taking this test. I don't care about the results. They don't need the results. We're just not doing it. There are states, and Bob can talk more about the states with the high school exit exam requirements. I mean, that is a problem, but as Ceresta said, you can push back against that. Some parents will say, "Oh, you have a graduation requirement? How about my child just gives their SAT scores? Why aren't SAT scores valid enough for a graduation requirement? If my kid took the SAT to get into college, do they really need these tests? I don't know. We have several college professors here. Have you ever looked at a student's standardized testing scores from K through 12 when you're admitting them into programs, right? We don't even see that information because it's not valid. And a lot of colleges are not even requiring the SAT anymore, right? So I think there are ways to push back, but again, get together, talk to other parents. And if you have a parent of means, reach out to the parents who don't have the means, right? I saw someone in the comments say he was getting pushback because his daughter is smart. And they were like, "No, we need her test scores." So there's that. They're going to tell you, "Oh, no, we need your kid to take these tests." Think about what that means to deny them that data, right, of your child. But then also think about how you can protect another parent who might not have that privilege, right? And work together in your community. And if you get, like Jesse is here in the comments, and he shared, teachers can come together and boycott a test. They did it successfully in Seattle. That's in that story, in that book as well, too, More Than a Score. So it can be done, but again, you have to work together. You don't want to be all by yourself trying to take on the school system, right? It feels intimidating, but if you get together a coalition of parents and you get enough parents in your schools to do it, people will join you because there's strength in numbers.
Okay, Ricardo?
I want to say that, one of the things that I think is missing from this work, right, is ongoing support for targets, right? Keeping it within the sort of the narrative of abuse. We can't take this work on in the spring, right, and turn our heads when test prep, benchmarking, and continued testing violence.
It's been going on all year. Yes.
Right, and testing in other forms is the name of the game, right? We need testing resistance all 4 seasons, right? We need to always bear in mind that the root cause, again, of this is capitalism. So it's important to sort of maintain this organizing. In Massachusetts, what we've done is hold a Zoom call every Saturday morning at 9 a.m. And what we do is we rotate organizations. One organization staffs the call, and anybody can jump in. And if they're experiencing pushback in a school district, they can talk about it, and the folks guide them through that process, right? So we have this every weekend, right? These are the organizers who have been organizing to opt out, have actually maintained those calls. But we also have a very powerful 2-minute, 3-minute video that is very clear in language, right? That sort of instructs parents on what to do. And what we've told parents is, look, there's one thing that school systems always want, right? Schools always want is to have that conversation with the parent, right? And we're explicitly telling parents, don't have that conversation and let them know that your decision is final, period, you know?
Exactly.
And if they force your kid, you know, to go to school and just sit in a room while everybody else takes the test, and you just sit there and you stare at a wall like they did to my daughter when we opted out years ago, I sent her with a t-shirt of a Scantron that says, this does not define you, right? And that day when she showed up to the testing environment, 5 other kids did the same thing. Their parents opted them out. The following year, we had 400 opt-outs in the city, you know, according to the school board, you know. So there are all these little strategies, but I think the way we get to it is to maintain the connection with families, you know, constantly, every week, be on the line with families, explaining to them what they should do and what they can do, the strategies they can take.
Thank you, Ricardo. Amy, Ceresta.
One of the things that on the United Opt-out website is a Get Tough guide, and there's also how to file a civil rights complaint. What parents have to understand, if they've made a decision and they want that decision to stick, they have to be willing to go the distance. And if it gets to the point where they have to file a civil rights complaint against that school, then they need to go ahead and do that. They do have the final say. And if they have a student who is academically proficient and they know does not need to be in a remedial reading class because they opted that child out, file the discrimination complaint. Schools do not like to get those at all. Trust me. They will go along with you if you do that. The other thing is, I think we really have to start educating people that many know, and we know it's when you're talking about social economics, we know it's those that are at the higher pillar of economic success in this country. They know for the most part that their students, if they don't have special needs, are going to do well on those tests. We've talked about the racial bias, etc. We have to start educating people about how white privilege factors into these tests. As people are becoming more and more educated as to white privilege, they have to understand that this is a clear example where that occurs. And if you start educating people on that level, I think they're going to be more receptive to being more adamant about opting out of these tests. They have to understand that these tests just really, if we're ever going to improve, they have to go. So that's some things that can do. On our opt-out website, they also have, we also have a standard test, a standard letter that they can submit at the beginning of the school year. And as Ricardo said, this stuff is timely. You can't just decide in the spring, I want to opt out. They have to establish the standards for their child from the beginning of the school year. Have that conversation with the administrator, with the counselor, and with the classroom teacher. And once that's understood and everything's documented, everything's there, if they do push back, once again, you have recourse. You can file the civil rights complaint against them. You can do the things that you need to do. If there's a bright child sitting in a remedial class, teachers pick up on that right away. That teacher that gets them that following school year picks up on that right away, and they're going to have that child placed appropriately if the parent hasn't fought hard enough to get it done themselves. With these EOCs, remember the goal is to demonstrate proficiency. You can do that in various different ways. You can submit a project that will boost that grade. And if you have that conversation with the teacher, with the administrator, my child is not going to sit for the EOC, not for the standardized test. They're going to do this instead to demonstrate their proficiency. They'll go along with it in a lot of ways. They will go along with it, but it's going to take pushback, and it's going to take a concerted effort to get large groups of people within each individual school community to stand together and make it happen.
Thank you, Ceresta. And I just want to give feedback to our panelists that I'm monitoring the chat as I'm listening to you. And one of the common comments is how clear your suggestions are, and people are really appreciating the very concrete steps that you give them in order to engage with the movement. Amy, I think you wanted to say something earlier.
Yes, I just want to pick up on a point that Denisha made earlier around testing and teacher professionalism, right? So I'd love to see more teachers engaged in this dialogue around their profession and their professional knowledge, right? And how testing undermines that, and how we know in the field of education a lot about how children learn, a lot about child development, and teachers are the experts on that, right? And so just relying on tests and only measuring students by tests is a way to deprofessionalize teachers, as we've seen for the last 30 years. And so I'd love to see more educators also working closely with parents in dialogue around these other ways of assessing students and their learning, right? So that it's not just throwing the test out and not doing anything else, but picking up on the New York Performance Standards Consortium, some of the strategies they're using. There's a new report coming out on some of the things they're using through Learning Policy Institute on the measures they're learning and how their students are succeeding, getting accepted into colleges. So we need to really build on those examples of where we're using other means to measure student learning, the veracity of those measures, and how, and just more research that shows the growth and development of students in schools that aren't relying on testing, as a way to build coalitions with educators and parents, while reminding us that teaching is a profession, that the field of education does have a body of knowledge, and that we are the experts on how we educate children, not the testing companies.
Thank you, Amy. Amy, if I may ask you a question, because you might know the answer. Is there any official statement by the AERA, the American Educational Research Association, which brings together scholars and educators around the country? Is there any official statement about testing?
Yes, so both the American Educational Research Association and the American Psychological Association have both argued the same as many of the psychometricians, that standardized testing should never be used in this consequential way, right? As the only measure that we use to measure student achievement, and to have these consequences tied to these tests, or one single test that can really derail a child's education and opportunities to learn in the future. So that is really very, very clear in the research, and for whatever reason, our policymakers have not listened to that. Okay.
I'm seeing a couple of questions from the audience, and I thought maybe we can address them. One is about language. An anonymous attendee is asking, are there any materials available in Spanish for parents who are not necessarily communicating in English as first language? Are there any materials for them so they know what to do when they engage with schools that speaks mostly in English? Anyone want to take that question? I think that's a really important one.
I think, Ceresta, were some of our materials translated in Spanish, or Bob, some of yours at Fair Test, I think?
Yeah, Ruth translated some of ours into Spanish.
Yeah. And I think the New York City opt-out material was in multiple languages, I thought.
Yeah, and I know the Citizens for Public Schools in Massachusetts is doing a Spanish language webinar on testing and opting out next week.
Yeah.
Yes, it's actually Wednesday, tomorrow.
Today's Wednesday.
No,
It's Tuesday.
Tuesday.
Okay,
Tuesday.
tomorrow Wednesday, got it.
You got me there.
You're right.
Yeah, we translated videos into Spanish, quick voiceovers, and we have all marketing materials in Spanish as well, Instagram posts, Facebook, and all that.
And Oren, if possible, I would like to, Ruth Rodriguez, who is a part of United Opt-out, one of the administrators, I think it would behoove all of us if a situation were set up where we could have a Spanish language, where we had the that community present a forum similar, a webinar similar to this. And if you would be willing to work with them, it would be a wonderful thing.
I'm more than happy. Unfortunately, my second language is not Spanish, but I'm more than happy to facilitate, and someone
to facilitate, yeah. And I'm going to have Ruth contact you.
I'm more than happy. Ricardo, just to go back to the resource you suggested, if you can put it in the chat box so people can have access.
Sure.
I'm already seeing our attendees organizing, and there is a wonderful Google Doc that people are putting together resources. This is really amazing. Another question that I see coming up. Just a second, I saw something. Yes, about convincing teachers and parents to start asking questions about opting out. Do you have any tips for how to start a conversation with parents around this?
Well, I will say that more and more parents, and Bob can attest to this, more and more parents are requesting information on how to opt their children out. So I think we have to take advantage of this right now, that there's a genuine interest, and we need to capitalize on that interest and try and reach as many through these type of dialogues, through dialogues that can go on Facebook Live, that are recorded, where they can actually refer to them, go back and view and listen. Bob, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think you're right. I mean, that the material on our website and on United Opt-out's website helps provide that information. And one of the things we found in talking to parents is asking them what they find to be a more useful measure of what their kids are doing in school. Do you believe the 10 test number, or do you believe in that your report card, or do you believe in the material, the graded material your teacher sends home, or that you can get at a teacher meeting? And almost always, we've seen polling on this, parents strongly prefer the evidence from teachers rather than standardized tests. So there's not much trust there. And once you get to that point, you can then ask, so why are we doing all this standardized testing? A typical urban high school graduate in the United States has taken 112 standardized tests in her public school career. And whatever you think of testing, that's a crazy number. You don't need to measure something 112 times. And the overkill nature of it, the pointlessness compared to other information that parents get about their kids' academic progress, helps open up the minds of parents to participating in efforts to roll back standardized testing, including opting out.
Any other final comments? Amy, please go ahead.
Yes, one thing we should also remember is the research on stress that's caused by the anxiety that the tests lead to, and the increase in suicide rates among middle school students in particular, since we've seen this rise in testing and high stakes testing. And so thinking about the social emotional development of children, which parents know very well, they live with children and they know when the social emotional development is being jeopardized by the kinds of stress placed on kids through testing. That might be another entry point into the conversation.
The stress issue or the social emotional condition that we are all at during this pandemic.
And I think one other avenue that we really need to take advantage of is when you have the collection of the mothers in the community of people who have lost their children to gun violence, and particularly gun violence from somebody that looks like them and is their age. I think when you look at the increase of gun violence on that level, it kind of goes along with, in my teaching career, the 30 years I've been teaching, it seemed to me that it escalated, and I mean the killing of peers. It escalated when the overemphasis on stamping failure on kids early in life escalated. They start out with a disadvantage psychologically. They've been told they're failing. They've been told that their school is failing. They've been told that their community is failing. And so it perpetuates the violence and the self-hate. And I wish somebody would do an actual study to see if there is, I'm not going to say it's causation, but maybe a correlation between the increase of standardized testing and the increase of gun violence among youth that look like each other. We know the suicide rates have increased, but how about the gun violence, the actual gun violence? We do know standardized testing has created a school to prison pipeline. There's plenty of information and data on that. But I think if we need to, the intersection between those people who are organizing behind the gun violence, and we need to start working with them to show them that part of your struggle is to get rid of the standardized test out of these schools as well. So your young children will not be stamped with failure early in life.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think, again, they say we want the testing to make kids college and career ready. And I think Ceresta mentioned this before. They are so far from being ready for college. The fact that most of us don't like teaching freshmen for this reason, because they come to us wholly unprepared for the rigors of academic learning because they just want to do multiple choice tests. And when I tell them that there are no tests in my class, that we're going to read reading and then we're going to do discussions and you're going to write essays and narratives, and they look at me like I'm crazy because that's not what they've done all of their time in high school. So it's actually robbing them of the preparation they need to come in and succeed in this environment. I don't want a bunch of test takers in front of me. I want students who know how to think critically and work in groups and ask questions and like get excited about learning. And they're not excited because school has been horrible for them because it's all been about test prep, And so I think that's like, talk to your children. A lot of parents, when United Opt-out was really going in its heyday, we get emails all the time. And it was parents like, my kid is on the verge of they can't take it anymore. Something's wrong. It's the testing. And that's what really led them to us. But even if your kid is not, ask your kid, and I bet you they'll tell you they're stressed, right? My freshman students talked about how stressed they were taking those tests, feeling sick the day of, it just messed with them. And they might not have told their parents, right? And so I think you have to ask and you have to investigate, is this really worth your child's mental health? Because it's not needed for any of the reasons people say it's needed. It's definitely not helping them for college.
Okay. We are going to end here. It's 8:45. We started a little bit late because of the technical glitch that we had. And I want to use this opportunity to thank again everybody for spending almost 2 hours with us tonight. This was first event that came out of a conversation we had with Ceresta and United Opt-out. And I think tonight, from the questions and from Ceresta's comment about the Spanish-speaking families, we might need to do more of this to really engage the public on issues of testing, race, inequality, equity, and education in the US. But for tonight, I want to thank everybody for their comments and suggestions. We had close to 100 attendees at some point, and people stayed with us for most of the time, and that's wonderful. We are going to send it out, the recording and the resource bank that people collected. I want to thank everybody.